Pattison. He is the author of Fossilmen, The Quest for the Oldest Skeleton, and the Origins of Humankind. Pattison is a journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, GQ, Fast Company, and Inc., among many other publications. And he spent more than a decade doing research for fossilmen, a large portion of which was spent in the field in Ethiopia with the team that discovered Arty, which we'll hear more about tonight. So we're so excited for your program tonight, Mr. Pattison. Copies of Fossilmen are available through our local bookshop in town, the Learned Owl. And Kermit was so kind as to send some signed book plates over to the Learned Owl so you can get an autographed copy of Fossilmen. And we'll put the link to the Learned Owl in the chat if you would like to purchase a copy. So Kermit, thank you for joining us tonight. We are very excited to hear this fascinating story, and I'm sure you have a lot to share with us, and I know our audience probably has lots of questions they would love to ask you. So thank you so much for your time tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank everyone in the audience tonight. I'm particularly excited to talk to this group because this is a story, even though the main discovery is in Ethiopia. This is a scientific saga, and many of the roots of this scientific saga are actually in Ohio. There's a number of scientists. The key players in this story are from Case Western, Kent State, and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. So there are a lot of Ohio people in this story. And then there's also a number of backstory threads that kind of wind through Ohio. One is the excavation at a place called Libin, which is an ancient cemetery in the Americas that was excavated decades ago. It's up near Toledo in what used to be the Great Black Swamp. One of the central characters kind of cut his teeth in anthropology working on that excavation and learning about skeletons by digging them up, basically. So that's one thread. There's also a monumental study of human remains that was done in Cleveland in the early and mid part of the last century by a guy named T. Wingate Todd in Cleveland. And what he did was he collected a lot of unclaimed bodies from the morgue. I mean, it sounds rather grisly, but basically claimed them for science and amassed this huge collection of skeletons, which still exists to this day. And it's a very important comparative collection that people from all over the world come to see. So that's another thread. Some of you have probably heard of the famous Lucy skeleton that was kind of a big find that occurred before the story that I wrote about. Well, Lucy was also discovered in Ethiopia, but that skeleton was brought back to Cleveland to study and resided. Lucy actually resided in Cleveland in a safe for a number of years while it was being studied, and then, of course, was repatriated to Ethiopia. Even the Kent State shooting, believe it or not, has a small role in the story that I tell in this book. So, yeah, as I said, there are a lot of Ohio threads that kind of weave together as part of the backstory that I tell in this book. So those different threads are examples of one of the distinguishing traits of paleoanthropology. Paleoanthropology is basically the study of human evolution, and it's anthropology with a paleo tacked onto it too. So that's what it means. And that one aspect of that is the search and discovery and interpretation of fossils, and that's what this book is about. And a lot of branches of science come together to make this discipline. They include anatomy, osteology, genetics, archaeology, anthropology, many other things. And this book tries to weave all those together into the story of a single skeleton. In this case, the story is about what is the oldest known skeleton in the human family. There are older fossils for sure and older species, but none of them are complete enough to be called a skeleton. It was found in Ethiopia in 1994. It belongs to a species called Ardipithecus ramidus that lived more than 4 million years ago. And the most dramatic member of that species is a skeleton nicknamed Arty. It's the skeleton of an ancient female who lived 4.4 million years ago in the Afar, what is now the Afar Depression of Ethiopia. And if you don't know where that is up in the Horn of Africa, kind of where the Great Rift Valley approaches the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And I can talk more about why that is a really productive area for fossils. We'll reserve some time of questions at the end, and the geology explains why this area produces so many fossils, and that's one of these components of this interdisciplinary field that I was telling you about. So that, in a nutshell, is what this book is about. There's a bit of backstory too, which again has many threads that run through Ohio, and that is the story of Lucy that I mentioned. So Lucy was probably to this day remains one of the most famous individual specimens in the human fossil record. Lucy was the skeleton of a petite, primitive member of the human family who lived 3.2 million years ago. She is interesting for a couple of reasons. She stood upright, and which is a distinguishing trait of humans that make us different than all the other primates. I mean, we are primates, we are apes, but we are truly weird ones. And one of the weirdest ways that of our being distinct is this strange mode of locomotion that we have. That's kind of one of the enduring mysteries of humanity. And Lucy cast a lot of light on that question because she was at 3.2 million years standing erect. She had a small ape-sized brain. She lived long before any stone tools. So this idea that existed before then really it goes back to Darwin, that upright walking and tools and big brains all kind of happened as a package. Well, Lucy destroyed that view, and she showed that upright walking came much earlier than 3 million years ago. Well, so Lucy was discovered. There are a lot of other members of her species that were discovered. It's called Australopithecus afarensis, and really, Lucy was part of a big bonanza of discoveries that happened in Ethiopia in the 1970s. And there are now probably several hundred members of her species that have been found. Not all of those are skeletons. Most of them are smaller pieces of individuals, like, a few teeth here or a skull there or a partial foot or whatever. But so I don't want to give you the idea that there's these hundreds of skeletons going around, but there are pieces of hundreds of other members of Lucy's species. So it's very well known. Anyway, as with much science, you answer one question and you raised 10 more. And so Lucy answered a lot of questions, but then she also opened up the door to all these other new mysteries. What came before Lucy? So upright walking, which appears to be pretty well established by Lucy's time, how did it start? What came before Lucy? Who were the ancestors of Lucy? And so that was the question that was on the table after Lucy came to light in the 1970s. And as I mentioned, Lucy lived 3.2 million years ago, and other members of her species go back a little bit older. But basically, if you think about Lucy's species living somewhere between like 3 and 4 million years ago, that part of human evolution really had a big light shown on it in the 1970s and 1980s. But what came before that? Beyond 4 million years ago, there was just this darkness. There was hardly any fossils that had been discovered. There were just very little known. And so that was the big mystery. What came before Lucy's species? And this was kind of the central question that drove the big scientific quest that this book is about. And people knew that one of the best places to answer that question was in the same valley that had produced Lucy, the Afar Depression of Ethiopia. The Afar Depression, as I was mentioning before, it's up in the Horn of Africa. It's where you have continental plates separating. And what that does is it creates kind of a basin. And into that basin, you get these layers of sediment stacking on top of each other. And it's very conducive to, number one, preserving fossils. And then number two, it's a volcanically very active area. So you have volcanoes erupting and spewing out this lava and ash. And that lava and ash is actually very useful for scientists because they can use some techniques to measure the radioactive decay, and therefore put dates on all these layers. And that's how we know, for example, that Lucy is 3.2 years old, or that Arty is 4.4 million years old. So this was the big mystery. What came before Lucy? And it took, so this book is basically about the quest, the 20-year quest to find some older fossils, and then the discovery of this remarkable skeleton that was turned out to be 1.2 million years older than Lucy. It's called Ardipithecus ramidus. The star specimen of that is this skeleton I mentioned earlier called Arty. And I'll just read you a little bit from the book to give you a little background. The book describes in the early chapters, sort of sets up this quest and then this very difficult searching that a scientific team of Americans and Ethiopians, this very difficult quest that they were conducting over many years. And this is then, as now, a dangerous place to work. It's hard, it's desert, there's not much water. There are wild animals, hyenas. Back then, there were even lions there. And a lot of snakes, very poisonous snakes. And there's also, at that point, particularly tribal warfare going on between two pastoral groups that happened to be fighting in the area where this team was searching. But despite all those hardships, they actually found this remarkable skeleton in 1994. And it turned out to be remarkably complete. It had, well, first of all, it was complete enough to call it a skeleton, which is in itself unusual at this age. But second of all, it had nearly complete hands, largely complete feet, a skull that, although it was smashed and broken, could actually be rebuilt. It had many of the limb bones. And so that's what made this Arty discovery so remarkable. And I won't have time tonight to get into the science about the hand or the foot or these other things, because some of this gets very esoteric very quickly. But I'll just read you one piece about one of the early revelations that came in the lab. So this occurs in the lab after they've found the first pieces of the skeleton. The field season ends, so they put everything in the cars, drive back to the museum, and the character who you'll read about, or who I will read to you about, is a fellow named Tim White, who is one of the central characters. He's a paleoanthropologist at the University of California at Berkeley. And this is where he starts to analyze some of the material they've just found in the field over the preceding weeks. And So that's a bit of background you need to know. And the other bit of background you need to know is there's a reference in here to something called the First Family. And basically the First Family was a site where they found a number of individuals of Lucy species, where they found more than like 200 fossils there. So this is explained in the book, but there's a brief reference to it here. So that's what that means. Okay. Chapter 11. This is called the Pliocene Restoration. The next big surprise came in the lab. Trailing plumes of dust, the expedition caravan slowly wound its way out of the Badlands at the end of the field season. For all the excitement, the discoverers still didn't know exactly what they had found. The skeleton arrived at the Ethiopian National Museum with many bones still encased in pedestals of ancient sediment, wrapped in orthopedic bandages and aluminum foil. A passerby might have mistaken the skeleton for a bunch of crudely potted bulbs that had yet to sprout. The team checked in their fossils at the museum and made a cursory announcement of their discoveries in a press conference in Ethiopia. The field season had been repeatedly extended to rescue as many fossils as possible before calling it quits. So White had time to clean only a single bone before catching a plane out of Addis Ababa. Acting on a hunch, he picked specimen number 88, a small foot bone known as the medial coniform. The medial coniform reveals whether or not a primate has an opposable toe. In apes, the far end of the bone bears a rounded, cylinder-shaped joint for the first metatarsal bone of the foot, which allows the grasping toe to open and close. In humans, the joint is flatter and holds the big toe in line. The loss of the grasping toe represented a watershed when our ancestors sacrificed climbing for walking upright on the ground. Had Aramitus crossed that Rubicon? In the closing hours before his flight, White sought to answer that mystery. Feet are rare in the fossil record. Extremities are filled with tasty ligaments and muscles, like a handout for the scavengers. Eat me. Quote, feet are carnivore hors d'oeuvres, explained White. They're out on the end of the limb and easily chewed off. They're one of the first things to go. Case in point was Lucy. Her lower extremity had only 2 toe bones and an ankle bone. Similarly, the discovery of at least 13 individuals of Lucy's species from the First Family site failed to yield a single intact foot. The best was a partial foot missing its front half. And when Tim White and Gensua had sought to reconstruct the feet that made the famous Laetoli footprints, they cobbled together a composite from 4 different fossils that span nearly 2 million years. This paucity of fossils gave rise to ferocious debate. But the Ramidus fossils were an extraordinary exception. The team picked up lots of 4.4 million year old foot bones. Some of the metatarsals, the long bones of the foot, resembled Australopithecus afarensis, that's Lucy's species, and hinted bipedality. So did a bit of ravaged skull base, whose shape suggested it sat atop an upright spine. But on the other hand, the fingers and toes seem long and curved, like tree-climbing apes. Specimen number 88 might reveal whether or not this creature bore the telltale sign of arboreality, a grasping toe. White sequestered himself in the hominid room at the National Museum. He was not a man prone to sentimentality, but something about fossils left him in awe. One of his greatest pleasures, a privilege, honestly, was witnessing the reappearance of extinct species. Quote, it really is kind of a time machine, he once remarked. As you take away those sand grains from a fossil, you're able to see an organism that no one has ever seen. In his eyes, damaging a fossil wasn't just a mistake. It was a crime against humanity. One clumsy move could destroy the last remains of extinct creatures never to be found again. He bemoaned the carelessness of peers writ all over the fossil record, fossils damaged with dental drills, high-pressure air guns, acid baths, and more. White believed that he could recognize the microscopic signatures of certain offenders. The very first hominid fossil found in Africa, the tongue child, was pockmarked by indentations where discoverer Raymond Dart had chiseled away the rock matrix with his wife's knitting needles. One Neanderthal skull had been smoothed with sandpaper. Other scholars mistook the scratches for an ancient mortuary ritual. Quote, the prepare damage across those fossils is obscene, White hissed. Sometimes he almost wished those specimens had remained in the ground rather than suffer such abuse at the hands of amateurs. A shape appeared beneath his microscope, a rounded surface on the far end of the bone. On the medial coniform, that could only mean one thing, the mobile jolt of a grasping toe, the mark of a creature that climbed trees. White's boyhood thumb-worn copy of the book Early Man showed an illustration of an upright ape man with a prognathous snout and a divergent toe. As he grew older, he came to realize that the beautiful illustrations were the fanciful imaginings of an artist. No such member of the human family had ever been found, until now. Here it was, a member of the human family with an opposable toe, something entirely new to science. White loathed the myth of the Eureka moment, a trope long abused by writers and publicity-pandering peers. In retrospect, however, he had to admit this bone was a genuine moment of revelation. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the entire skeleton. He didn't have time to remove all the rock matrix yet, but he had exposed just enough to reveal something very important. As psychologists have demonstrated, the source of expertise is really no secret. It simply is the ability to recognize patterns based on years of experience. White had written the book on bones, but on questions of locomotion, he listened to one man. In the final hours before catching his plane out of Ethiopia, White walked down to the casting lab and ordered a duplicate of the Medial Coniform. He would send the cast to the one expert he trusted on such matters. And at that moment, his old friend lay in self-imposed exile, reeling from personal tragedy and forgotten by much of the profession. And then the next chapter shifts to Ohio, of all places, where we meet the fellow who he's talking about at the end of that chapter, who's named Owen Lovejoy, who had actually been a central member of the Lucy team back in the 1970s and 1980s. And then he became, again, with this new skeleton, Arty, a central member of this team. So this book is really about a tale of, in some ways, it's a tale of two skeletons, Lucy and Arty, and how the science changed in that time. But I'll stop there. I think I've talked at you for enough, and I'm happy to take questions and delve into what any subtopic that you all would like. So have at it.
You talked a lot in the book about some of the controversies with finding Arty. Can you share some of those with us tonight?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and it's a difficult question to encapsulate because this is a very controversial field, and there's controversies throughout. I mean, the science is all about debate, and when you're at the frontiers of science, as you are with these discoveries, there's a lot of difference in interpretation. The evidence is often fragmentary. The questions are big. And so people are trying to answer, big questions about, where did we come from with the best information that we have, which is usually way less than you would like to have. So I'll just say that. I mean, this is a controversial field in general. But this particular group of characters, both the central protagonists and their opponents, engaged in some very intense and sometimes very personal battles. So I'll just mention a couple of the big bullet points about what made Arty controversial, in addition to just the general scientific debate that's always sort of percolating in the background in this field. But with Arty in particular, one thing was controversial before the skeleton was even revealed, and that was The time the discovery team took to study it and interpret it before it was shown and described to their scientific peers. The skeleton was found in 1994. And well, the first part of the skeleton, I should say, then the excavation took 3 years. And then meanwhile, that's just that Arty skeleton. Meanwhile, before and after, there is a lot of searching going on, and they're finding pieces of many other individuals. Now, that's just the fossils from our family. They're also collecting many, many more other fossils, which, that includes like the ancient antelopes, the ancient pigs, ancient plants, fossil wood, you name it. They decided they were going to do 100% collection, which means because they found such a rich deposit, they were going to take everything off the ground and come back year after year after year. Because what happens out there in these Badlands is there's constant erosion of the sediments, and so new fossils are coming to the surface. So this was an ongoing effort, and they decided they were just going to study it until they felt confident in their findings, and before they revealed that they were not going to do like progress reports. That was a strategic decision they made, but it was very controversial because their peers are clamoring for this fossil. So the secrecy was a big point of controversy, and the scientific team's refusal to issue sort of like progress reports or preliminary reports was very controversial. So it took 15 years between Arty's discovery and the eventual publication. So that's one. And as I mentioned, that became controversial long before the thing was even published. It was like, why are you taking so long? Why can't you tell us about why can't we see it? Number two, it was also very surprising. Many people had begun to answer questions about what humans look like, and then Arty comes along, and it's hard evidence, and in a lot of cases, she defied expectations, and so I think that's always hard when there's evidence that's surprising. One big point, related point, was the discovery team really emphasized all the ways that Arty was surprisingly unlike our closest ape relatives, which are our closest primate relatives, which are chimps and bonobos. And so why is that controversial? Well, in the decades before this, there had been a lot of discoveries in molecular science that established with great certainty that humans are very closely and very recently related to chimpanzees and bonobos. And Jared Diamond even wrote a book that you might have heard of called The Third Chimpanzee. And what that title refers to is that you have chimps and bonobos. There are two species of chimpanzees, and we're so closely related that he was arguing that you could almost consider us a third chimpanzee. And in the wake of those molecular discoveries, a lot of anthropologists and people in different branches of science were really turning to the chimp as like a model, as a proxy for the primitive humans. So that the thinking there was that, well, we humans have evolved a lot, and the chimps have evolved not so much, that they're kind of a representation of the primitive. And then when Arty comes along, I mean, she's certainly ape-like. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you saw her, you would think that she was an ape, but she's unlike a chimp in a lot of like really interesting and really significant ways, and ways that are probably sort of pretty astounding to people who study this stuff closely. One is that she does not go walk like a chimp, and she showed, in the interpretation of the scientists who discovered her, no hint of a knuckle walking ancestry. So that's a pretty big difference right there, because she had a different form of locomotion. Many other ways, I mean, too many to get into here, but in many ways that the skeleton was surprisingly unlike a chimp. And that has been hugely controversial because there is a large part of the scientific community that study chimps, either directly study them or use them as models for behavior, anatomy, many other things. And the Arty team was very aggressive in pushing this unlike a chimp angle, and that ruffled a lot of feathers. So that's another point of controversy. I mean, I could keep going, but one big one that I should mention is the question of, did they place Arty right in our family tree? So the Arty team concluded that this was indeed a primitive member of the human family, if not a direct human ancestor, at least something on the human branch after we split from our cousins, the chimpanzees and bonobos. And that makes her what we used to call a hominid with an ID at the end, and now the terminology has changed, so people say hominin, but you could just think of it as something in our family after we split from our ape cousins. So, and all of the conclusions they've drawn are significant because of their implications for human evolution. There has been a pushback school which has said, no, this fossil is not in fact a member of the human family. It's some other ape lineage that went extinct. So I'd say that was a point of controversy that was, or a kind of a counter school that was very vocal right after this thing was published in 2009. There's still some people that believe that, but I think that that group has shrunk, and actually more and more scientists have accepted Arty as a member of the human family, but often with a different interpretation about what it means. So that's another point of controversy. One other thing I should mention, I mean, I could keep going about savannas and other things, but the method of analysis that was kind of controversial. The different schools of thought about what scientific tools or scientific methodologies you should use. So that was a point of controversy. And then there was some of it was just personal too. I mean, there's some very strong characters involved here with old grudges that go back decades, and I don't think you can discount those things. I think that the personal politics do in fact play, do rear their ugly human head in this case, and I think that's undeniable. So those are just a few things.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Kermit, you spent some time in Ethiopia?
Yeah. I took 2 trips there. So I took a trip there, my first trip in 2013, and then I went back in 2016. My first trip was to a different, the project area they have that this group operates in is huge. It's like the size of like Rhode Island. I mean, it's just giant. And it's so basically what project area means is that the Ethiopian government awards a scientific team a permit to explore a certain geographical area. And I mean, that's what this team gets. That's what many other scientific team gets. And then within that, they're free to work wherever they want, because there are a lot of different places in that area where they could work. And different sediments in different parts of the area have different ages. So in this particular area, these guys, they're called the Middle Awas research team. That's the team that discovered Arty, and that's the team I went out there with. They have some deposits that are 6 million years old, and they have some that are 4.4 billion years old, where Arty was found. They have other stuff that's much younger, 1 million or 160,000. So they get a huge span of human evolution represented in this area. So they can work in different parts. And then, as I mentioned before, there's some security concerns. So from year to year, maybe things are kind of hot and dangerous in this part of the project area. So they have to go work somewhere else. So as a result, because they're going to all these different parts, I got to see 2 very different parts of the project. In 2013, I saw one area which was on the east side of the river called the Awash. And then in 2016, I went back, and they were actually working again at the same place where Arty was discovered, trying to find, in that case, what they hoped would be a second skeleton, located near Arty, just like 200 meters. They had seen some clues, things coming out of the ground that led them to believe there might be a second skeleton there. So I was there for part of that excavation. I'll reveal the big reveal is that unfortunately there was no skeleton there. They dug and dug and dug and didn't find a second skeleton, unfortunately. So anyway, 2 trips.
Nice. Okay. Well, we have lots of questions from our audience. So Marcia asked, how did you get interested in this field? So I know you have a background as a journalist.
Yeah. Well,
what kind of got you interested in this?
Yeah, it was really an accident. I mean, I was interested in this field in general, and I thought what I set out to do was to write a book about the evolution of human locomotion. And just to put it to you really briefly, I mean, humans are weird primates in a lot of ways, and one of them is how we get around. And we also have, we're weak and we're slow, but we do have this ability to trek pretty well, run and walk long distances. And I'm a runner and endurance athlete and skier. And so I was kind of interested in like the evolution of the human aerobic capacity. And so then I came across this Arty skeleton, and it had been published, but it hadn't gotten that much attention. I mean, there was a big media fanfare when it was announced, but then it kind of just was kind of didn't have the kind of uptake in the field, and so as a result, it was very easy to miss if you're in the general public like I was. But anyway, I came across it and I said, oh, this is kind of interesting. Maybe this is like a little bit of background, a paragraph of background. And then I make contact with the scientists and start hearing the stories about what they found in Arty and some of the conclusions that they drew from the skeleton that really seemed to contradict a lot of prevailing wisdom. And hearing the stories of discovery and meeting the people, and I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe this is a page. Maybe this is 5 pages. Oh, geez, this is more really interesting. Maybe this is a chapter. Oh, God, no, this is like 5 chapters. And then eventually, this went on for months. And finally, I said, this is so much more interesting than what I set out to do. I mean, it's interesting because the science, because of the skeleton being so complete, as I mentioned, you could actually tell quite a bit in the story of this one skeleton about the natural history of the human hand, or about the skull, or about the foot. I mean, all of these body parts have really interesting evolutionary stories that are all part of, they're part of primate evolution, and then they're all part of human evolution. So the skeleton was scientifically interesting because it allowed me to write about the natural history of the body. But then, as I mentioned, that the backstories of working in this area were really interesting. And I'll just tell you another one that I haven't talked about, and that is the emergence of Ethiopian scientists. Now, a lot of times when you watch a documentary about anthropology, a lot of the scientists that you see are white Westerners. They're Americans or Europeans or whatever, and these are kind of like the talking heads. And human origins is a science that is largely set. And the early human history is, as far as we know, before 2 million years ago, is entirely set in Africa. But for decades, the Africans themselves have been really absent from the ranks of the storytellers. Well, in Ethiopia, because of some very deliberate efforts that some scientists made, and also because of some demands that the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian scientific community were making, this new generation of indigenous Ethiopian scholars emerged. And some of those people became very prominent, internationally known scientists, and including the guy who's a curator now at the Cleveland Museum. I mean, he's a good example. And several of those people became sort of key players in this Arty story. So that's not the whole part of the book, but that's just one storyline that I found so fascinating, because it's a book about the human past, but it's also a book about sort of the colonial roots of the science and the fight, and it was a fight in a lot of cases, to chart a sort of post-colonial version of the science. So I've given probably a much longer answer to the question than that person really wanted, but it's that's kind of one example of why I was so surprised by this book and why I sort of accidentally walked into it and found all these interesting human and scientific backstories. Every time I turned over a rock, I mean, goddamn, there was something else interesting that I just couldn't ignore. And so that sort of compelled me that, you know, this is a book waiting to be written.
Okay, we had Mary asked, I know you did talk a little bit about it, but Mary asked, what was the Kent State connection to Arty?
Okay, yeah, it's not a, it's just a personal backstory of one of the characters. So there's a fellow named Owen Lovejoy, who is an anthropologist at Kent State University. And he happened to have been, he went to Kent State shortly before the anti-war protests and the shooting. And he just told me the story about when he was there as a young professor. You know, there was all this activism happening on campus and all this, you know, Vietnam War protest. And one day he stepped out onto the roof of his building because there was this protest going on. And I think there were probably a lot of protests in those days. And then he was watching this sort of crowd. He could sort of see the crowd, but some of the key events, key interactions were kind of obscured by a building. But then he heard this pop, 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 and he told me he thought it was firecrackers. And then they hear the screaming and the sirens. And so that's the Kent State connection. It's just an episode from the biography of this scientist who became later one of the key players in Arty and Lucy.
Edward asked, when did the Great Emigration from Africa begin and what were the routes?
Okay. That's a very complicated question, and you won't get, certainly not for, you won't get a definitive answer from even the world's greatest expert, who is not the person sitting here, just to for the record. But okay, as far as we know, humans, members of the human family began to leave Africa around 2 million years ago. That's when you start to see things, you know, fossils in Eurasia, basically, and then how many waves were there? Well, there's probably a lot. And that's kind of post the Arty, so I haven't kept up on the literature, but there's an ongoing debate about just involving Neanderthals and many other species about whether when these primitive primitive members of the human family go out into Eurasia, like Homo erectus or Neanderthals or whatever, are they going out and then just becoming dead end branches who are then displaced by more advanced creatures, species who are continuing to in this what they call the African exodus, or is there gene flow back and forth? Are these are these creatures either sending genes back to Africa, through interbreeding, or are they are basically interbreeding when they meet? I mean, so I'll just give you one example of Neanderthals. For a long time, there was this debate about whether Neanderthals evolved into modern humans. So were Neanderthals ancestral to us, or were they this dead end branch that just went up in Europe, and then kind of got isolated up there during the Ice Age when Europe was an icebox, and then were they replaced by what they call modern Homo sapiens, which are like the earliest members of our species? And this debate went on, and then the genetic the genetic revolution really shed a lot of light on that. And some of the early genetic studies from mitochondrial DNA suggested that basically that Neanderthals were displaced by our species of modern humans. And so then, this is like in the 80s and 90s, people said, okay, Neanderthals, the debate is settled. They were a dead end. They went extinct, kaput. Never say that's the end of the story in science, because science advances and the science of genetics, what we now call genomics, has advanced just by light years. It's one of the most exciting, I think, areas of research in human origins. And as the science progressed, genomic scientists were able to get a kind of a higher resolution picture of what's going on in the human genome. They were able to rescue some ancient DNA from these Neanderthal fossils or Neanderthal bones that had not completely fossilized yet. Once they fossilized, you can't do the genetic analysis, but some of them were quite old, but they had not completely fossilized. So the scientists were able to extract DNA from them. And then, sure enough, they found that actually there was some interbreeding with Neanderthals, and that many of us, particularly those who have ancestry outside of Africa, carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in us. So that's just one example of what that person is talking about, which is like how much exodus was there. I do oftentimes see, as you probably do, like these maps of like dispersal. And I always have to roll my eyes a little bit at them, because sometimes that information is presented with a sort of finality, or meaning like a certain certainty that I don't think necessarily is easily exaggerated. I've seen people, make claims about the routes that ancient humans took. They went through this pass or over this strait. And I think that story is going to be so much more complex than we know right now. So to answer the question, I haven't really answered it in a direct way, but because I just think that is unknown and it's kind of out of my area of expertise. But I suspect that that's going to be a really complex story with waves of immigration and sometimes new species, but sometimes just, other populations of the same species.
This is a good question. I know I wondered myself, how far below the surface are the fossils typically found?
Well, actually, that's a really good question, and it raises an interesting point. So I think the popular conception is that the scientists do a lot of digging to find, that's how they find this stuff. And that digging certainly does happen, and Arty was found by an excavation. But in this part of the world, actually, most fossils are found on the surface, or at least the initial discoveries are found on the surface. And let me explain why that is. So as I mentioned before, this part of the world is what they call a Badlands. It is a sedimentary geology. So just picture like stacks, that the old stuff below and younger stuff above. And then, over time it rains and there's not much vegetation there. So there's a lot of erosion. And as that erosion occurs, these ancient fossilized bones spill to the surface. And that happens with every rainy season. So these areas recharge themselves, if you will, putting new fossils on the ground. And so if you are a scientific team, the most efficient way you can do at least the initial surveys is to walk, to figure out what their productive outcrops are and, what their ages are, and then to send teams out to walk and scan the surface. And this is a real art. And there's some people who are really, really good at spotting things. And sometimes you're looking at things in like fields full of rocks and animal dung and plants and just all the debris that's on the ground. And so to be able to spot a fragment of a tooth or a broken bone that's in a really weathered condition is a real talent that I am absolutely in awe of how good some of these people are. So that's how, like in the case of Arty, the first pieces were found by one of those walking surveys, and they found a piece on the surface. And it was a bone from the palm of the hand. And it was broken. And so they find this thing and they say, oh, wow, okay, there's something here. But, in many cases, they'll find an individual piece like that, and that's all they find. It it eroded out of God knows where. It's might have traveled some distance over the surface, and they always try to do the kind of detective work to figure out where it came from. But many times they cannot figure that out. But in this case, they could, because they started finding other clues. So they found this broken piece of hand, and then go back over other days and finding other elements of the skeleton. So this tells you, okay, well, there's multiple elements of the skeleton here. They still don't know, is that one individual, from one skeleton, or is this like a bunch of stuff that's gotten jumbled together? But they find more and more pieces, and then sort of the index of suspicion is getting higher, and then they start sieving, which basically means like scooping up the sort of surface soil and then sifting it through a screen, a sieve, and then finding more pieces, teeth, bones, and then started finding pieces that were still what they call in situ, embedded in the original sediments. And when you find that, that's like bingo, because that tells you found the original resting place of the original spot of burial. And that's, once that was found, then they said, okay, we'll do an excavation. You don't waste time on an excavation if you don't believe there's something there, because it's a really time-consuming process. It takes large groups of people to like systematically take up all that soil really carefully, sieve it. It's just if you don't, if that excavation is a bust, you've just wasted a huge amount of time and people power. So most of the initial finds are on the surface in this part of the world. Other parts of the world where you see like fossils in caves, that's a different story. But in this part of the world, the initial finds are often on the surface, and the excavation happens after you see enough to justify digging.
That kind of leads into the next question. With excavating taking many years, is theft of fossils a problem? Or what precautions are taken?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I can only talk about this area. So this area is still pretty wild in the Afar Depression, and the local people there are pastoralists, and they had been. It's a really fossil-rich area, so these pastoralists had been stepping over these bones for years. They would see these rocks, that shaped like a bone. They even had a name for them, Gahola, they called them. And so to them, the things are not real valuable. They only become valuable when they know the scientists want them. And then, I think the good scientists, just like, number one, get cooperation with local people, but also explain to local people, don't try to dig it up yourself. Don't carry it. Don't, just tell us where it is and we'll send the experts to go there. So in this case, they did the excavation, but it's a multi-year thing. And so when they had to close down the field season, they would often like pile rocks on it. Actually, they would pile rocks on it every night. And actually, in that case, they were not worried about theft by humans, but had a problem with carnivores, jackals, coming around and digging stuff up because they smell all this like human activity. And sometimes the scientists would use chemical hardeners to drip on the bones, because some of them, if the bone is at all crumbly, before you dig it up, you drip this hardener on it, which will allow the bone to consolidate, and then you can remove it more carefully. Well, Tim White, one of the scientists who was on this excavation, was telling me that something about the hardener really is attractive to these jackals. So they'll come around and dig. And so they have to put these big stones down to keep the animals from digging. So that is a concern. But in this, I haven't heard much about theft happening out there. I think if you have a relationship with the local people, then hopefully they know, like, don't take things. And then if they do take it, that fossil frankly becomes a lot less valuable because its origin is open to question. Because scientists like to find things in their original sediment because that will allow them to make authoritative determinations about how old it is, where it came from, et cetera, et cetera.
One of our patrons asked, where can people see the Arty model? Is it something we can even view, or is it?
Okay, well, the Arty model. Well, so the actual bones are in Ethiopia. Basically, any fossil you find in Ethiopia stays in Ethiopia, unless, and the exception is, two exceptions. One is if there's reason to take it out of the country for scientific study, like at different times, Arty and Lucy and some other fossils have been sent out of the country to be CT scanned, for example. At one point, the Lucy skeleton went on a museum tour in the United States a few years ago, but this was hugely controversial, actually, and some of the scientists really objected to it because their argument was basically, why do you, this is like a treasure of science, and that you're putting it at risk by sending it around to museums, and the average member of the public would be just as happy just looking at a cast, because the casts are actually quite accurate, quite good. The cast is just basically like a 3D copy of the bone. So so where can you see a model? I think online there's some pictures. There's an artist who's done a really beautiful image of Arty as a skeleton, and then he also put flesh on her. And his name is Jay Maternus, and if you Google Arty, you'll probably see them. But those are the best images, I think.
Okay, we have Nicholas asked, is there evidence that these beings buried their dead?
No, not at this age. So that's kind of behavior that's like more advanced, and you don't see that kind of deliberate burial until much later. And I don't remember exactly when the first evidence is of deliberate burial. I mean, there was some fossils that were claimed to be the earliest evidence of intentional burial in South Africa, but that claim is hugely controversial. But certainly by the time you get to some things like Neanderthals, where they're burying things with like what they call, with some of their favorite possessions or symbolic things. I mean, it's happening then. But by the time this early in human history, there's no evidence of any kind of deliberate burial like that.
All right. Was there any determination of diet?
Yeah, actually,
fossils that were found.
Yeah, and actually, there's a couple of sources of information about diet. One of the most important one is teeth, and there's you can tell a lot about the shape of the teeth and the enamel on the teeth. So fruit eating animals or primates have different teeth than fruit eating apes, let's say, have teeth that are distinct from leaf eating apes or omnivorous apes. So Arty appeared to be somewhat fairly omnivorous, probably feeding in the trees and on the ground. Probably ate some fruit. No, they can't tell you, what Arty had at tea time or whatever. I mean, exactly what the diet was, but they can tell a lot about chemical composition, what type of foods that Arty ate, based on, this gets into complicated science, but on what sort of type of photosynthesis the plants used. And there's plants that are divided into two categories of called C3 and C4. So they can make some determinations about the sort of diet that Arty lived, or that Arty had. And another important source of information are like these microscopic abrasions on the teeth. And if you look at this stuff with like a powerful microscope, you can see the scratching, that you will, that different sort of foods leave. And a coarse foods like you tend to have out on the savannas is different than like soft foods like fruits that you would have in a forest. So they could make some determinations that way. And anyway, the bottom line is that Arty appeared to be somewhat omnivorous.
All right, and we have one final question. Thank you so much for taking all your time tonight answering all of our patron questions. Does the discovery of Arty push back the split between hominids and apes back before 7 million years? It is my understanding that based on DNA and other things that the split occurred around 7 million years ago.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's also, I mean, you keep hearing me say this, use this word, but controversial, and that is a big point of controversy. When was the split between humans and our closest ape relatives? This is kind of interesting in the Arty story because the science kind of changed underfoot while this story was underway. At the time Arty was discovered, scientific community was thinking that the split between humans and our chimp bonobo cousins might have been as recent as 5 million years ago. So Arty being 4.4, that's like hard upon the split. You're getting like really close to that split time, and so that was a cause for great excitement back in those days. So now most of the scientific community seems to be thinking that the split was actually deeper in the past. It's older. And the science of making estimates about when splits occurred is, there are a lot of assumptions that are built into that. You have to make, so they can measure the genetic difference between humans and chimps. But the question is, how long does it take that difference to accumulate, or what's the rate of change? And there are a lot of assumptions that go into that, like how long are the generation times, what's the population size, and so on. There's many estimates, assumptions that have to be made, and that sort of accounts, among other things, for why that split time is kind of a moving target. But the general consensus is that it is, in fact, older than they used to think it is. And here there's a kind of a range of opinions, and the studies show a possible range that's pretty big. And so 7 million years seems to be a popular sort of figure. 6, some people think it's even older. Some people think it's even older than 10. One thing to keep in mind here is that it's very easy for us to sort of imagine that the split is this decisive thing, like boom, that a mother and father say, okay, I'm going to call you chimp, and I'm going to call you human. And it's not, the split is not always that decisive. Sometimes there's populations that are splitting at different rates. So like genes in your body, just in the human genome have different histories. And for some genes, we have a common ancestor that's 5 million years old. And for some genes, I'm just talking about humans now, not chimps, but we have we all converge on a common ancestor that's much more recent. Well, with our relationship with chimps, it's also similarly complex. So now I think there's a pretty good argument that split between humans and our ape cousins might have been a really protracted event, with some populations splitting and then going away for, splitting for a while and then coming back into contact and interbreeding again. So it may not be this kind of decisive fork that people imagine in the old days. It may be this rather messy, genetically messy event that actually occurred over hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of years.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Kermit. We appreciate hearing about your fascinating story and, of course, your time for answering all of our questions. Again, if you are interested in obtaining a copy of Fossil Men, we have the Learned Owl has signed copies of Kermit's book that you can purchase. There's a link in the chat. Thank you again so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we are so thankful that you were here with us tonight to share your fascinating story.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. It's always a challenge to sort of boil down really complicated topic into talking points. So as a consequence, I kind of felt the need to write a 400-page book to sort of explain all this complexity and backstory. But so thank you. If you have any other questions, obviously the book is the best source of info, and feel free to reach out to me on my website. And thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.